The open road stretched endlessly before us, flanked by rolling hills and occasional patches of woodland. The hum of the car engine was steady, a comforting background to the otherwise quiet drive. It wasn't often that Logan and I spent this much time alone together. "I still think we should have taken the flight," Logan muttered, his gaze fixed on the scenery whizzing past the window. I glanced at him from the driver's seat, suppressing a smile. "Where's the fun in that? A road trip is supposed to be an adventure. Breaking down in the middle of nowhere sounds more like a disaster than an adventure," he replied dryly. "You've got no faith," I teased, tapping the steering wheel. The tension between us was light, easy. For a long time, Logan had kept his distance, viewing me more as the woman who married his father than someone he could really talk to. But over the past few months, our relationship had thawed. He'd started to see me as more than just a stepmother. As if on cue, the car shuddered, the engine sputtering before falling silent. "You've got to be kidding me," Logan said, sitting up straighter. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart sinking as I stared at the dashboard. A myriad of warning lights blinked ominously back at me. "Guess the car didn't get the memo about our adventure," he quipped, unbuckling his seatbelt. I sighed, stepping out of the car and popping the hood. The warm air smelled of oil and metal, and it was clear from a cursory glance that we weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Logan joined me, his brow furrowing as he peered at the engine. "Looks like you're calling for roadside assistance." I pulled out my phone, relieved to find a signal. After a brief call with a less-than-helpful dispatcher, I returned to the car, shaking my head. "They'll be here, but it's going to take hours." Logan groaned, leaning against the car. "So, what now?" "We wait," I said, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. By the time the tow truck arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The driver, a grizzled man with a thick southern drawl, confirmed what I'd suspected. The car wasn't going anywhere without serious repairs. "There's a small town about 10 miles up the road," he said. "Got a motel where you can stay while they work on your car." "Looks like we're stuck here," I said to Logan as we climbed into the tow truck's cab. The motel was exactly what I'd expected, modest, with faded signage and a parking lot that had seen better days. But it was clean and, more importantly, available. "I'll get us checked in," I said, grabbing my bag. Logan followed me to the reception desk, where a cheerful clerk handed over the keys to a room with 2 twin beds. "Welcome to the Lazy Pines Motel," she said brightly. "Hope you enjoy your stay." Our room was small but cozy, with worn carpeting and a small TV bolted to the wall. I set my bag on the bed nearest the window, stretching out the tension in my shoulders. "Well," I said, forcing a smile, "at least it's not raining." Logan smirked, tossing his bag onto the other bed. "Small blessings, I guess." After a quick dinner at the diner next door, we returned to the room, the awkwardness of our situation beginning to settle in. Logan flipped through the TV channels aimlessly while I sat by the window, watching the occasional car pass by. "You're awfully quiet," Logan said, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, surprised. "Just tired, I guess." "You've been running around a lot lately," he said. "Work, the house, taking care of Dad." I shrugged. "It's what I signed up for." "Doesn't mean it's not exhausting," he replied, his tone softer than usual. I studied him for a moment, noting the concern in his expression. "It's sweet of you to notice," I said, smiling. "Someone has to," he said, his gaze lingering on me. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Logan's breathing from across the room. The events of the day played over in my mind. The breakdown, the motel, the quiet conversation that had left me feeling unsettled. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, a tension I didn't know what to do with. When I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were restless, filled with images of Logan's eyes, the way they'd softened when he looked at me. The next morning, the early sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting long beams of light across the room. I stirred awake, stretching out the stiffness in my limbs. Across the room, Logan was still sprawled on his bed, one arm draped over his eyes, the faint rhythm of his breathing filling the quiet space. I hesitated, watching him for a moment. His features, usually sharp with sarcasm or indifference, looked softer in the pale morning light. There was something about him like this, unguarded, vulnerable, that made me pause. Shaking off the thought, I grabbed my phone and checked for updates from the repair shop. As expected, the news wasn't good. The necessary parts wouldn't arrive until the next day, meaning we were stuck at the motel for at least another night. Great, I muttered under my breath. What's great? Logan asked, his voice groggy as he sat up. I turned to him, forcing a smile. The car's not going to be ready until tomorrow. Guess we're not going anywhere, he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. After breakfast at the diner next door, we found ourselves wandering through the small town. It was quaint, with a single main street lined with antique shops, a bakery, and a bookstore. Logan seemed content to follow my lead, his usual snark replaced by an easygoing demeanor. In one of the shops, I found a small trinket, a carved wooden keychain shaped like a sunflower. Reminds me of the ones my mom used to grow, I said, running my thumb over the smooth surface. You should get it, Logan said. I hesitated, then nodded, adding it to my purchase. That evening, back at the motel, we decided to order pizza and watch a movie. The TV was small and the sound tinny, but the simplicity of the moment felt comforting. Halfway through the movie, Logan made a sarcastic comment about the over-the-top action sequences, and I burst out laughing. You're terrible, I said, wiping tears of laughter from my eyes. You're the one who picked the movie, he shot back, grinning. For a moment, the tension that had been simmering between us all day seemed to dissolve, replaced by a lightness that neither of us had expected. As the movie ended, Logan stretched and stood, heading to the small kitchenette to grab a bottle of water. I stayed on the bed, my thoughts swirling. You know, he said, leaning against the counter, this isn't so bad. What isn't? I asked, glancing up at him. Spending time with you, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks and quickly looked away. You're not so bad yourself, he chuckled, taking a sip of water. High praise coming from you. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. It wasn't anything we'd said or done, but the air between us felt different. Heavier, charged. I glanced over at Logan's bed, half expecting to find him already asleep. Instead, his eyes met mine in the dim light, his expression unreadable. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low. Not really, I admitted. He hesitated, then sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Wanna talk? I nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around myself as he moved to sit on the edge of my bed. We talked for what felt like hours, our voices barely above a whisper. Logan shared stories from his childhood, moments he'd never mentioned before. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing details of my own life that I usually kept hidden. You've been through a lot, he said softly, his gaze steady. So have you, I replied, my voice trembling. His hand brushed against mine then, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through me. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. Logan, I began, but the words caught in my throat. It's okay, he said, his voice barely audible. I care about you. I looked away, my chest tight. We can't, I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I know, he said, his tone heavy. He stood then, his movements slow, deliberate. Good night, he said softly, retreating to his bed. Good night, I murmured, my heart pounding. Sleep didn't come easily after that. My thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, questions I couldn't answer. I told myself it was just the circumstances, being stuck here, away from everything familiar, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. When morning came, I wasn't sure what the day would bring, but I knew things between us had changed. The morning sunlight felt sharper than usual, cutting through the thin curtains of the motel room. I stirred in my bed, the tension of the previous night still clinging to me. Logan was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his phone in hand. Morning, he said, his voice quiet. Morning, I replied, sitting up and running a hand through my hair. "Did you sleep?" "Not really," he admitted, setting his phone down. Neither of us spoke for a moment, the weight of our unspoken thoughts settling over the room like a thick fog. "Let's get some breakfast," I said finally, needing to break the silence. The diner was busier than usual, the hum of conversation and clinking dishes filling the air. Logan and I sat in a corner booth, the tension between us simmering just below the surface. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed as he studied me. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though the knot in my stomach told a different story. He didn't press, instead turning his attention to the menu. But I could feel his gaze flicker back to me every now and then, his concern evident. As we finished our meal, the waitress approached with a bright smile. "You two make a cute couple," she said, setting the check on the table. I froze, my cheeks flushing as Logan chuckled softly. "We're not." "Thank you," Logan interrupted smoothly, flashing her a charming grin. She left before I could correct her, and I turned to Logan, my eyes wide. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it doesn't matter," he said, his tone light. But the way his eyes lingered on me said otherwise. By the time we returned to the motel, dark clouds had rolled in, casting the town in a gray gloom. Rain began to fall in steady sheets, the sound drumming against the roof like a heartbeat. "We're really stuck now," Logan said, dropping onto his bed with a sigh. "At least it's cozy," I said, trying to inject some levity into the situation. He smirked, shaking his head. "You always try to find the silver lining, don't you?" "Someone has to," I replied, sitting on the edge of my bed. For a while, we sat in silence, the sound of the rain filling the room. It started innocently enough, a shared laugh over a memory, a casual touch on the arm as I reached for my drink. But as the hours passed, the space between us seemed to shrink, the unspoken tension growing heavier with each moment. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Logan asked suddenly, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to look at him. "This," he said, gesturing around the room. "The road trip, the breakdown, being stuck here together. It's just bad luck," I said, though my voice wavered. "Or fate," he said softly, his gaze steady. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "That's a little dramatic, don't you think?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But it doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on me. "Logan," I began, but he interrupted. "I know this isn't right," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't help it." Before I could respond, the power flickered, the room plunging into semi-darkness as the storm outside intensified. Logan stood, moving closer to the window to peer out at the rain. "We'll probably lose power completely," he said, his tone practical. I nodded, my heart racing as I tried to steady my thoughts. But when he turned back to me, the look in his eyes stopped me cold. "Why do you look at me like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't stop," he said simply. My chest tightened, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over me. "This isn't." "Then tell me to stop," he said, stepping closer. "If you don't feel the same way, tell me to stop and I will." But I couldn't. The space between us disappeared in an instant, his hand brushing against mine, tentative but deliberate. My breath hitched as his fingers intertwined with mine, the warmth of his touch sending a jolt through me. "Logan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I need to know," he said, his voice low. "Tell me you don't feel this, and I'll walk away." I couldn't find the words, my silence speaking louder than anything I could have said. The storm outside raged on, the thunder echoing in the distance as we stood there, the weight of our unspoken connection finally crashing down around us. Later, as the storm began to subside, we sat in silence, the gravity of what had happened settling over us. "This changes everything," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "It doesn't have to," Logan replied, his tone steady. I looked at him, my chest tight. "It already has." He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." For the first time, I allowed myself to believe him. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warming the small motel room. I stirred awake, my mind heavy with the events of the previous night. Logan was already up, sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't look at me when I sat up, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside. "Morning," I said softly, my voice tentative. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence between us charged with unspoken thoughts. "I didn't mean for things to get so complicated," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Complicated doesn't always mean bad," he replied, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that morning. After a quick breakfast at the diner, we returned to the motel, unsure of how to fill the hours until the repair shop called. The tension from the morning had eased slightly, replaced by an unspoken agreement to take things one moment at a time. Logan suggested a walk through the nearby woods, and I agreed, grateful for the chance to clear my head. The trail was quiet, the air fresh and cool, as we meandered beneath the canopy of trees. "I always liked being outdoors," Logan said, his voice thoughtful. "It clears my head. It's peaceful," I agreed. We walked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of our steps grounding me. For the first time since the trip began, I felt a sense of calm, as though the weight of my thoughts had lifted, if only slightly. When we returned to the motel, a familiar truck was parked in the lot. My stomach dropped as I recognized the vehicle. It belonged to my husband, Logan's father. "What's Dad doing here?" Logan asked, his brow furrowing. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. We stepped into the lobby to find him talking to the clerk, his expression serious. When he saw us, his face broke into a relieved smile. "There you are," he said, walking toward us. "I've been trying to get a hold of you. Thought I'd come see if everything was all right." I forced a smile, my mind racing. "The car broke down," I explained. "We've been stuck here waiting for repairs." "I figured something like that," he said. "Thought I'd drive up and give you a hand." Logan's expression was unreadable as he glanced between us. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his tone even. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My husband insisted on taking us to lunch at a nearby restaurant, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Logan was quiet, his usual wit replaced by a guardedness I hadn't seen before. I could feel his eyes on me during the meal, but neither of us dared to say much. Back at the motel, my husband booked a room for himself, assuring us that we'd all head home together once the car was fixed. "It's good to have the family together," he said that evening as we sat in the lobby. Logan's jaw tightened, and I quickly changed the subject, desperate to steer the conversation away from anything that might reveal too much. Later that night, unable to sleep, I stepped out of the room for some fresh air. The cool night breeze brushed against my skin as I stood on the balcony, staring out at the empty parking lot. "Couldn't sleep either?" Logan's voice startled me, and I turned to find him leaning against the wall a few feet away. "No," I admitted. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "This is hard." "I know," I said softly. "I don't regret it," he said, his voice firm. "Do you?" I hesitated, my chest tightening. "No," I said finally. "But it doesn't make it any easier." His hand brushed against mine, the contact sending a familiar jolt through me. "We'll figure this out," he said, his tone steady. Before I could respond, the sound of a door opening behind us shattered the moment. We turned to see my husband stepping out, his expression curious. "What are you two doing out here?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "Just couldn't sleep," I said quickly, stepping back. He nodded, his gaze lingering on us for a moment before retreating back into the room. The next morning, the repair shop finally called with good news. The car was ready. Relief washed over me as we packed our bags and checked out of the motel. The drive home was quiet, the weight of everything unsaid filling the car. My husband was in high spirits, oblivious to the tension between Logan and me. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I felt an odd mix of relief and dread. The trip was over, but the consequences of what had happened lingered, a shadow that neither of us could escape. Later that evening, As Logan prepared to head back to his apartment, he found me in the kitchen, washing dishes. "Leaving so soon?" I asked, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "Yeah," he said, his tone soft. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of our shared secret hanging heavily in the air. "Take care of yourself," he said finally, his voice breaking. "You too," I replied, my heart tightening. As he stepped out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, just the beginning of something neither of us could fully understand. The days following our return from the trip were a blur of routine, but nothing about life felt normal anymore. Logan kept his distance, throwing himself into work and avoiding family dinners. My husband noticed the change, though he attributed it to stress or exhaustion. "You should check in on Logan," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. "He seemed off when we got back." I forced a smile, nodding. "I'm sure he's fine. He's just busy." But I knew the truth. Neither of us was fine. A week later, Logan showed up at the house unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced as I wiped my hands on a towel, stepping out to meet him. "Hi," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Hi," he replied, his gaze steady but guarded. My husband was out running errands, leaving us alone for the first time since the trip. The silence between us was heavy as we stood in the doorway, neither of us sure what to say. "I just needed to see you," Logan admitted finally, his voice low. "Logan," I began, but he cut me off. "I know," he said quickly. I can't pretend nothing happened." His words sent a jolt through me, and I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the air between us charged with unspoken emotions. Logan's eyes were filled with a mix of longing and frustration, and I struggled to hold his gaze. "This is impossible," I said finally, my voice breaking. "Why does it have to be?" he asked, his tone earnest. "Because it just does," I said, shaking my head. "Your father—" "I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted. "I just needed to see you, to know you're okay." I looked at him then, my chest tightening. "I'm not," I admitted. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the weight of our shared truth hanging heavily in the air. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. My husband's voice called out from the entryway, and Logan stood abruptly, his movements sharp. "I should go," he said, his voice low. I nodded, my heart pounding as he headed for the back door. "What's he doing here?" my husband asked as he entered the kitchen, his brow furrowed. "He just stopped by," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Wanted to say hello." My husband's gaze lingered on me for a moment, but he didn't press further. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts were consumed by Logan. The distance between us was unbearable, and the weight of our secret felt suffocating. I reached for my phone, hesitating before typing out a message. "We need to talk." The reply came almost instantly. "Name the time and place." The next evening, I told my husband I was running errands and drove to the park on the edge of town. Logan was already there, leaning against his car, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come," I said as I approached. "But you asked me to," he replied, his tone steady. We sat on a bench beneath the streetlights, the quiet of the park amplifying the tension between us. "I can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Neither can I," he admitted. "But I can't walk away from you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Logan, this has to stop." "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. "Because it's wrong? Because people wouldn't understand? I don't care about any of that." "But I do," I said, tears filling my eyes. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I care about you," he said softly. "More than I should, maybe, but I can't help it." My resolve wavered, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe him. When I returned home, my husband was waiting in the living room, his expression concerned. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Of course," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You've seemed distant lately. I just want to make sure you're all right." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. But as I climbed into bed that night, I knew the truth. I wasn't fine, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. In the weeks that followed, Logan and I kept our distance, each of us trying to find a way forward. The connection between us remained, unspoken but undeniable, a thread that bound us despite everything. Sometimes, love isn't about happy endings. Sometimes it's about letting go.